Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for Justice, Sir Ashley Fox.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 1 and 11 together. We know prolific offenders represent only 10% of offenders, but account for nearly 50% of all sentences. This clearly cannot continue. That is why I have specifically asked David Gauke to look at this in the independent sentencing review to ensure that we have fewer crimes committed by prolific criminals.
Sir Ashley.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Lord Chancellor for her answer. Can she tell the House what data her department holds on the nationality of prolific offenders and what steps she will take to deport those that are non-British?
I thank the member for his question. He will know that, of course, we do retain data around foreign national offenders, and this government is on track this year to remove more foreign national offenders this year than the previous year. This is obviously something I want to make further progress on, and I hope that there will be consensus across the House so that we remove those who commit crimes in this country and have no right to be here.
Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's early release scheme has an impact assessment for it to run for 10 years. For however long it does run, will the government confirm that no prolific offenders will be released early?
Well, the impact assessment is done over what is the usual period of time, but I have committed to reviewing this policy specifically in 18 months' time from the moment it was brought in, which is a commitment that we will keep. And on prolific offenders, I recognise that we have a problem with prolific offending. It has gone up over the last decade or so, and that is why I've specifically asked the Sentencing Review Panel to consider the interventions that we should make to cut the cycle of prolific offending.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Retail workers in my constituency tell me they can predict almost to the week when somebody will arrive at their store to begin shoplifting again after their oftentimes all too short sentence. Does my honourable friend agree with me and them that the solution to hyper-prolific offending must be longer sentences in certain cases?
The length of sentences and how to deal with the problem of prolific offending will be looked at specifically by the Independent Sentencing Review Panel. He'll understand why I cannot preempt the findings of that review, but I know he will note that this government has committed to scrapping the effective immunity for some shoplifting that was introduced by the previous Conservative government by removing the £200 threshold, which shows that we are determined to clamp down on the sort of shoplifting that he describes.
Shadow Minister Kieran Mullan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know one of the key ways in which we manage prolific offenders is tagging, both GPS tagging and home detention tagging. The Secretary of State has assured us that the problems with early release tagging have now been resolved, but I understand that across the thousands of other prisoners who are due to be tagged, problems persist. Can the Secretary of State assure the public that everyone that is being released that should be getting a tag is being tagged on time?
Yes, the specific problem that he refers to in relation to Serco and the performance around the 2 tranches of the SDS 40 releases has now been resolved. That backlog has been cleared, and the performance of Serco is now back to where it should be. Of course, continue to monitor their overall performance under the contract, under regular review.
Dr. Kieran Mullan.
I've heard the Secretary of State didn't answer my question. I acknowledge that the problems with the early release scheme have been tackled, but I'm told by many people working in the criminal justice sector that there are many other delays with the thousands of other prisoners who are due to be tagged. Again, can the Secretary of State assure the House that those people who are due to be tagged across those thousands of other prisoners are being tagged on time?
Yes, there are no additional issues in relation to the tagging or the process by which the tagging takes place with Serco, but where there is contract failure by Serco, we won't hesitate to take action. We've already imposed financial penalties for the things that went wrong with the SDS 40 releases. It is something that we have under regular review. The Prisons Minister in the other place discusses these matters directly with Serco on a regular basis, as do my officials, and it's something we will continue to monitor.
Biddy.
Please, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prison Estate Conditions Survey programme is a live assessment of the condition of our estate, but there is still much to do. Approximately 4,000 cells were lost to dilapidation under the last government. That's why we're investing £220 million in prison and probation service maintenance in 2024-25 and up to £300 million, Mr. Speaker, in 25-26.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. A constituent and now prisoner of HMP Coldingley wrote to me recently about the appalling conditions in his prison. He spoke about the prevalence of drugs, violence, discrimination and denial of access to healthcare. And in his most recent letter to me, he said that the conditions got so bad that he made an attempt on his life. Now, another report on Coldingley described conditions as inhumane. So what urgent work can the Minister tell me about to ensure that all of our prisons have humane conditions for prisoners?
This government is determined to ensure the best possible conditions in our prisons. We've inherited a crisis in our prisons, I'm afraid, but if the honourable member wishes to write to me about the particular issue, I'd be very happy to write back to him.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The condition, especially of our Victorian prisons, is not conducive to rehabilitation or preparation for life on release. The government is pressing ahead with the construction of 20,000 new prison places, which their predecessor failed to honour. What thought in the design and operation of these major new prisons has been given to the training, education, addiction and mental health needs of inmates for whom prison is currently little more than a human warehouse?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. Obviously, these new prisons will be built with all the things he mentioned taken fully into account. The government is determined to put 14,000 more prison places in place.
Glenn Stewart.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, this government launched domestic abuse protection orders in selected areas. This will improve protection for victims of domestic abuse, including non-physical abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour. We have also committed to fast-tracking rape cases through the courts to deliver swift justice to victims of this abhorrent offence.
Elaine Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited South Ayrshire Women's Aid in my constituency of Ayrcarrick and Cumnock as part of the 16-day of activism against gender-based violence. Would the Secretary of State join with me in praising the hard work of Women's Aid in supporting women and girls who have suffered violence, and would she agree that we need more support for these organisations up and down the country, particularly in respect of reliable funding?
I wholeheartedly echo my honourable friend's words there. The vital work of organisations such as Women's Aid, they do such brilliant work in empowering women and children to rebuild their lives after experiencing domestic abuse. This government is committed to halving violence against women and girls within a decade, and that is why I have decided to protect violence against women and girls victims' spending in the Ministry of Justice by maintaining the current funding levels for sexual violence and domestic abuse support for the next financial year.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In August 2008, Alan Jermy brutally murdered Kirsty Wilson, strangling her and setting her body on fire while their two young daughters slept upstairs. He has now been recommended for transfer to an open prison, which could allow him unchaperoned access to the community within 6 months. His daughters, now 18 and 23, who are my constituents, are terrified at the thought of encountering him, or worse, him coming to their home as he knows their address. Will the Lord Chancellor meet with me and these young women to discuss their fears and ensure this transfer is stopped?
I would be delighted to meet the honourable gentleman and his constituents to discuss the case.
Tony on the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware of increased reports of intimate image abuse and the rise of deepfake pornography. What is her department doing to ensure that women and girls are safe online and that this modern form of abuse can be prevented?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. This government shares the concern that more needs to be done to protect women from this appalling form of abuse. That is why this government made a clear commitment in our manifesto to criminalise the creation of sexually explicit deepfake images of adults, and I look forward to setting out our position on this in more detail soon.
Roberts.
4 schoolgirls suffered sexual abuse by their head teacher, Neil Foden, who was sentenced in July to 17 years with a 2/3 tariff. The CPS now tell me Foden will instead spend half his sentence in prison because the most serious of his crimes could only be sentenced to 14 years. Will she meet me to discuss how to safeguard the victims whose abuser was in a position of trust because they live in fear of his early release?
I'm aware of the appalling case that the Right Honourable Lady mentions. It is horrific, and all of my thoughts are with the victims of these crimes. If the Honourable Lady wants to write to me with more details, I will happily look at this case. As she knows, sentencing is a matter for the independent judiciary, but I will look at the case and meet with her to discuss it further.
Paul Davis.
Question 4, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer question 4 and 7 together. We are mandating careers advice in prisons and introducing a life skills curriculum. All released prisons have employment advisory boards to connect prisoners with work, and banking and ID administrators are preparing prisoners for life after prison.
Paul Davis.
The UK faces a major labour shortage, costing billions annually. Many ex-prisoners, lacking prospects, return to a life of crime. Enhancing prisoner literacy, numeracy and vocational training can help equip them with skills for employment, leading to a reduction in reoffending rates. I welcome the Get Britain Working White Paper that will address this issue. Does the Minister agree that failing to tackle this issue will not only pose a lifelong challenge for individuals, but also create a significant problem for the state, including lost opportunities and increased crime?
Yes, I do agree with my honourable friend. We know that having a job and a home are the best ways of reducing reoffending. That's why we have employment hubs in all resettlement prisons where prisoners can access job vacancies and support with their applications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
2 members, please. Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. He will know that prison governors have a duty, statutory duty, to ensure that prisoners are prepared for life outside prison before they're released. And clearly one of the main issues is finding a secure home so that they can actually have somewhere secure that they're living, rather than going back to the place where they've probably been involved in gangs and other individuals. What action is he taking now that prisoners are being released early from their sentences to make sure that they're fully prepared for life outside prison so they're not risking reoffending?
I thank the honourable member for his question. We know that accommodation is a key to reducing reoffending. That's why we're expanding our transitional accommodation service and working closely with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to develop a long-term strategy to put us back on track to ending homelessness and making sure this is tackled correctly.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Number 5, Mr Speaker.
The Government recognises that there are serious concerns about the funeral director sector, and the legislation that governs what happens after we die is outdated. We are considering how to ensure appropriate standards are introduced, including through the potential for some form of regulation. We have also asked the Law Commission to create a future-proof legal framework to address what happens to our bodies after we die.
Dr. Luke Evans.
I'm grateful for the Minister's answer, and she'll know we've been in correspondence about this sector. She kindly wrote back that the Phase 2 Fuller Report inquiry has released its interim report. I have a constituent, Joseph Barbsby, who runs G Sellers. They're one of the biggest independent funeral directors. He's very passionate about how we can bring forward a compassionate way at looking at people who die, but making sure standards are kept high. Would she consider meeting me and him to discuss this further, as there's a way of making sure we bring this into the 21st century?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. As he will know, the vast majority of funeral directors treat people in their care with the utmost respect, like his constituency business, but there are nevertheless some very serious issues of concern in the sector. As I mentioned, the Government is currently considering the full range of possible next steps on this, and that includes meeting with the sector directly, and I'd be happy to inform him about when this is taking place so he and his constituent can take part.
Yeah. Just before I come to 6, I noticed it was grouped. I'll be quite honest, I cannot see a relationship why they were grouped. I hope it can be passed back to the department saying we really do need to have relevance in that. Dr. Danny Chambers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Number 6.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Victims Code sets out the services and support that victims of crimes are entitled to receive from the criminal justice system in England and Wales. This includes the right access to support, which applies regardless of whether they decide to report the crime directly to the police. We provide police and crime commissioners with annual grant funding to commission local, practical, emotional and therapeutic support services for all victims of crime.
Well, Stephen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. England's home to 85% of the world's chalk streams. They're very rare habitats, and we're lucky to have the River Itchen and the River Meon going through my constituency. We know that they are struggling. Only 17% of chalk streams are rated as under good ecological health, and that is partly because of over-abstraction, partly because of pollution, and partly because of water companies dumping sewage in them. And we know that this not only destroys the biodiversity, but it also makes people who swim in it sick. Will the Minister, well, in addition to coming down harder on water companies, will the Minister commit to implementing a sewage victims compensation scheme for this particular problem?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will ensure that the honourable member's comments are passed to DEFRA and the responsible Minister for water quality. But I can confirm to the honourable member that we are committed to delivering for nature, taking action to meet our Environment Act targets, and we work in partnership with civil society, communities and businesses to restore and protect our natural world.
Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer question 8 and 15 together. We will expand our transitional accommodation service and we will launch employment councils to strengthen the relationship between employers and HMP Prison and Probation Service.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer. People who commit crime should be prosecuted and put in prison as quickly as possible. It's also clear that we need to do more to stop reoffending rates to keep the public safe. I think in order to keep up with the current demand for prison places, we need to build 3 mega jails a year, costing millions to the taxpayer. Given these facts, will the Minister agree with me that we need to invest in technology to bring reoffending rates down so that we can help these people turn their lives around, but crucially, keep the public safe?
Absolutely. Public safety is our #1 priority, and new technology gives us every advantage to do things differently, and that's one of the things that the Independent Sentencing Review under David Gauke will be looking at.
Aldridge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Providing quality education and training for offenders is one of the most effective ways we can reduce reoffending. Western College in Weston-super-Mare runs a transformational prison education programme across the southwest of England, which supports successful rehabilitation, resettlement and employment of offenders on release. Can the Minister advise on what steps the Department is taking to ensure more offenders can develop the skills they need to successfully gain employment and reintegrate into society?
I very much welcome the work that Western College does in prisons. We are also developing our training offer for employers in areas such as rail track and construction, and HMPPS's Creating Futures Opportunities programme is working to improve the employability of offenders in both prison and the community.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I declare an interest as the founder and chairman of a prison rehabilitation charity. The Minister is very helpfully setting out what the government is doing about reducing reoffending, and I very much welcome that. Is he aware, though, of the enormous pressure that is put on prisoners who are approaching the end of their release, given the pressures that the prison service is under, partly because of early release itself, which is releasing prisoners before they've finished programmes that are provided, whether by charities or by the prisons, in prisons, but also because of just the churn of prisoners being shipped around the prison system because of the pressure on the system. Is there anything he can tell us about what the government is doing to ensure that prisoners approaching the end of their sentence have some stability in the prison that they're serving in so that they can get supported as they approach release?
Well, several of the things I've mentioned already are designed to do exactly that. We recognise exactly what he says. I would have to say that on the SDS 40 scheme, the prison and probation officers have done an outstanding job in supporting prisoners through that journey.
Mr Breen.
Mr Speaker, a constituent of mine in Frimini, Somerset, reported a rape and sexual offence case well over 2 years ago, but is, like many victims, still waiting for her case to be processed by the Crown Court, leaving her pessimistic about the criminal justice system's ability to properly tackle violence against women and girls. What is the Ministry of Justice doing to tackle the backlog and support victims of VAWG through the criminal justice system?
So it's not really... It's not really relevant to the question that's been asked. Don't worry. Patrick Spencer, I'll have an example.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we took immediate action to prevent the collapse of the prison system by changing the automatic release point for standard determinate sentences. We are building 14,000 new prison places and will publish our 10-year capacity strategy shortly, which will set out exactly where and by when we will get the places that we need. The last government left prisons in crisis. We will fix them for good with that 10-year capacity strategy and the independent review of sentencing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what this government is doing to increase prison capacity, but what is the Secretary of State going to do on tougher sentencing? And I ask that because if she goes to my constituency of Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, she'll be met with a tough, gruff East Anglian accent that says, what's the point of building prison places if you're not going to use them?
Well, I'm sure his constituents will also recognise that even with the new supply that we are building, we are still going to run out of prison places because the demand into the system is much higher than the building that is being planned. We simply cannot build our way out of this problem. And so in order to make sure that there's always a prison place for the people that need to be locked up and that we never run out of prison places again, we do have to have an independent review of sentencing.
Senator Secretary of State Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lady Chief Justice has said that the courts are not operating at full capacity, perpetuating the record numbers in prison, on remand, awaiting trial. There could be an extra 6,500 sitting days if the government allowed them. Cases such as rape and sexual assault are being pushed into 2027. Baroness Carr warned the Justice Secretary that failure to maximise judicial capacity would actually cost the government more in costly and limited prison places. And yet the Justice Secretary failed to agree to her request. Why is the government letting out criminals rather than hearing more cases?
I'm tempted to remind the Shadow Minister about his own government's track record. He ought to know that it was my predecessor, his colleague, the last Lord Chancellor, who agreed the allocation for sitting days with the Lady Chief Justice, and that concordat agreement was concluded during the election period when the Tories were still conducting business. So perhaps he'd like to explain, when he responds, why the allocation was made for only 106,000 sitting days. What I have done, Mr. Speaker, is increase sitting days by a further 500 and increase magistrates' court sentencing powers, which is the equivalent of an additional 2,000 Crown Court sitting days, in order to start cracking down on that backlog.
Instead of increasing sitting hours, the Justice Secretary's defining intervention in her 5 months in office has been to accidentally let out dangerous criminals from our prisons. And just last week, she rushed to Parliament to close loopholes she created for stalking, for disclosing private sexual images, and for murder. She could be signing deals with other countries to get new prisoner transport agreements. She could be using visa sanctions with foreign countries to force them to take back the 10,000 foreign criminals in our prisons. She isn't. Meanwhile, criminals are being released and are re-offending already. Will the Justice Secretary commit now to end her dangerous and unnecessary early release scheme?
Mr. Speaker, I do think the Shadow Minister could at least have apologised to the country for being part of a government and a party that ran out of prison places. It was the Tory party that ran the system at boiling hot, over 99% capacity, and I hate to remind him, but it was the Tory party that had their own emergency release scheme operating for months before the last general election, which did not have any exclusions for offences connected to domestic abuse. I'll take no lessons from him, because it is this government that is cleaning up the mess that his party left behind.
Look, Meyer. 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
The Conservative inheritance on the Crown Court backlog was dire. Instead of cutting the number of cases waiting to be heard as they promised, the backlog of cases exploded under their watch. This government is gripping the problem. We've taken important first steps. We've funded 106,500 Crown Court sitting days this year. We've also increased magistrates' sentencing powers to free up more sitting days in the Crown Court to hear the most serious cases. But we know that there's more to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm campaigning to put more police on our streets, but this is only part of the picture. This backlog in our courts means the entire criminal justice system is creaking and justice is being delayed. This time last year, there was a backlog in my region of over 9,000 cases. So will the Minister ensure that this Conservative court chaos is dealt with and offenders are brought to justice?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to describe the situation as Conservative court chaos. Indeed, the full picture of the last government's terrible inheritance will become clear when we publish Crown Court data later this week. Demand at the criminal courts is increasing at a faster rate than the actions that we're able to take, and we must therefore go further. Because this government understands the scale of the problem and is ready to confront it with the fundamental reforms that are going to be necessary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister referred to court chaos. A tribunal judge and a court worker have both written to me from my Taunton and Wellington constituency. The tribunal judge says tribunals are being cancelled every day as they say there are not enough judges to cover the cases. This is absolutely not the case. People are waiting months for their benefit appeals in appalling poverty, yet we cannot deal with the cases because of the limit on sitting days. What will the Minister do to increase sitting days in Taunton courts and in Somerset courts?
I thank the honourable member for his question. We are investing in increased court capacity. We're investing in the recruitment of 1,000 judges and tribunal members. As the Lord Chancellor said, we've increased Crown Court sitting days this year by 500 days. But it's not simply enough to increase court sitting days. We have to look at fundamental reform to address the serious backlogs that we've inherited from the last Conservative government.
Question number 12, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is determined to provide support for all victims of crime. That includes publicly consulting on a new revised victims code in the new year. I would also like to remind the honourable member that the gambling minister in the other place recently announced a legally mandated levy on the gambling companies to address gambling harm, to introduce NHS-led treatment and support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome that response from the Minister. Gambling addiction destroys lives. In fact, only last year, on average, every year, 496 gambling-related suicides occur. But it's not just the life of the gamblers that get destroyed. There's also an invisible group of victims, and that is the families of those who have to pick up the pieces. Speaking to a local charity in my constituency, Spinney Hill Drug Alcohol Addiction Support told me of a talented young man from a deprived socio-economic background whose family saved every single penny to send him to university. He spent that on addiction because of his gambling and more. This family are now inspiring debt, and the whole family unit has been destroyed. I welcome the Minister's statement, but would she agree that these companies should also pay a levy to help compensate families, especially when children are becoming addicted?
So the government has recently announced its mandated levy to provide support, NHS-led services from the Commission, from the companies directly. I will pass his comments on to DCMS to have that answer.
Rebecca Smith.
Number 13, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bearing down on the outstanding caseload in the Crown Court and bringing down waiting times is a priority for this government. We want to make sure that every victim has swift access to justice that they deserve. We know that rape victims are waiting disproportionately long for their trial, and that is why we have committed to working with the judiciary to fast-track these cases through the court.
Thank you for that answer. Recently, Truro Crown Court, which serves my constituency of South West Devon, has been forced to shut one day a week due to the recent budget cuts and the judicial sitting day reductions. Some cases have already been postponed until late 2025, including some lengthy cases that involve victims of violence, and it's prompting them to consider withdrawing their cases. Given the maxim justice delayed is justice denied, what additional steps are being taken to support victims in particular to continue with their cases across Devon and Cornwall?
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. As she knows, rape is an abhorrent crime and cases are usually complex. That means that despite the judges prioritising cases involving vulnerable complainants and witnesses, rape victims can wait disproportionately longer than victims of other cases for their trial to come to court. I would just like to remind the Honourable Lady that this government has actually increased the amount of court sitting days by 500 this year, and the Lord Chancellor has also agreed to increase capacity in the magistrates' courts so we can get through cases more quickly. We are also introducing independent legal advocates to advise rape victims from report to trial in the new year to ensure that they stay in the system longer so that they do feel supported and get to trial.
Davis.
In the last 5 years, the number of magistrates covering Telford and wider Shropshire fell from 91 to 76, and in 2022, 50% of the court sessions went unused. While it was in the Crown Court, victims are waiting an average of 18 months, and some sexual offences taking up to 3 years to be dealt with. Telford voted for change. Will the Minister ensure that victims of crime get justice and criminals are punished?
Absolutely, Mr Speaker. As my honourable friend, the Minister for Courts, has already outlined the steps that this government is taking to increase sentencing within our courts, we will of course consider what other action is available. We know that the budgetary position this government faces is incredibly tight thanks to the inheritance we received. However, it is vital that the decisions we make are fiscally responsible.
Shrewdbury.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. SDS 40 was an emergency measure that we had to take to avert the complete collapse of the criminal justice system following the shocking inheritance left to us by the previous government. The emergency measure is not, of course, the solution to the crisis that we inherited. That's why we will build the 14,000 prison places that we need, and we launch the independent review into sentencing.
Sir Edward.
What concerns me is not the past but the future and how to protect the public. So will the Secretary of State assure me that the screening process is sufficiently robust to ensure that violent and dangerous criminals are not released into the community?
Yes, well, I would gently say to the honourable member that the past is relevant insofar as it sets the crisis that we've inherited that needs resolving, and it is important, given that we all but ran out of prison places, fell down to fewer than 100 in the summer, that we recognise that the prison system is and has been on the point of collapse. That's why we've had to take emergency measures. We have made exclusions to the SDS 40 scheme that should take account of the concerns that he has raised. It is, of course, important that offenders, when they are not in prison, are monitored and supervised effectively. That's what we are trying to do now, but also where I think that tech can play a bigger role, which is something that I've asked the independent review into sentencing to look into.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babberin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Because there are no specific offences of domestic abuse in the law, abusers hiding behind convictions like ABH are being let out early under the SDS 40 early release scheme. This is not right, so I've proposed a bill to create a specific set of domestic abuse aggravated offences, a bit like racially aggravated offences, which could be excluded from early release schemes. Women's Aid are backing my bill. Will the Secretary of State back it too?
It's right to note that under legislation as it currently is, it's only possible to exclude offences rather than classes of offenders. I'm sure his 10-minute rule motion or private members' bill will gain some interest across this House. I think those changes, if any were to be made, are for a point in the future that does not help us with the current crisis now, and I'll ensure that we discuss with the Home Secretary as well the details of his bill.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. I hope I get the chance to meet with her to discuss it in more detail. Liberal Democrats are deeply concerned about survivors who have been told that their abuser is set to be released early as it stands. One is Elizabeth Hudson, who I met on the set of Good Morning Britain earlier today when launching this campaign. She's written to ministers with concerns, but she says she hasn't received a response to those. Will the Secretary of State meet with Elizabeth and I to discuss her case and discuss how survivors can be respected and protected?
I believe all who have written have received a response from the Ministry, but I will chase down that specific case. Because of the way that we implemented this policy, we were able to give the probation service, some time to prepare, which was not available to them under the last Tory government's end of custody supervised licence scheme, and that has enabled that all victims who were supposed to be notified under the victim notification scheme have been done so.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question number 16.
Mr Speaker, I have recently met with the Chief Coroner. We did not discuss the specifics of this issue, but coroners have a statutory duty to investigate deaths which aren't reported to them if they suspect that the cause is unknown, violent or unnatural, or that the death occurred in custody or other state detention.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer. The charity SUDEP Action, which stands for Sudden Unexpected Death in Epilepsy, is based in my Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage and provides specialist support for bereaved families. Improvements to the coroner's service would help to reduce trauma, improve understanding of the causes of death and enable more research to aid prevention of future deaths. Will the Minister press for more investment in and support for the coroner's service?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government recognises the impact of delays and the issues that are facing the coroners at the moment and the impact that is having on bereaved families and the wider systems. We welcome the recent Justice Select Committee's report on the coroner service, and I look forward to working closely with the Chief Coroner, local authorities and other key partners to devise and deliver a wider strategy for development of these services.
Kim Johnson.
Question number 17, Mr Speaker.
My honourable friend is right to ask this question. A process was already underway from the previous government to put new contracts in place for prison maintenance. We need to make sure that these deliver good value for the public purse.
Thanks for that response from the Minister. But the prison's maintenance contract is set to be retendered to the private sector next year. Prisons like Wallington in my home city of Liverpool, a crumbling Victorian prison, struggle to get the smallest repair undertaken. And we're aware that there is 1.8 billion of unreported repairs within the prison system. So we know privatisation leads to higher costs and an increase in squalor. So can the Minister or the Secretary of State call time on this failed experiment and bring prison maintenance back in-house where it belongs?
Well, the previous government paused work on essential maintenance, and that's added to the problem that we're dealing with now. And she's right to say that all options need to be looked at to ensure that we get the best possible value for money for the public purse from any new contracts or new arrangements.
Jim Shabana.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for that response? Minister, one of the stories that's been quite prevalent in the press over the last 2 months has been the amount of mould growth, which obviously will lead to health issues as well. Is it within this new prison maintenance service that the Minister has referred to that issue can specifically be dealt with? Because if it's not dealt with, it would lead to ill health in prison amongst those who are in the prison custody.
Well, clearly issues such as that need to be dealt with, and certainly HMPPS staff are doing their utmost to try and tackle those issues, but we will redouble our issues after his encouragement.
We now come to topicals. Antonia Barnes.
Topical question. Number one, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, last week the National Audit Office released a damning report on the last government's record on prison building. It showed that their promise of 20,000 prison places by the mid-2020s was hollow. Unwilling to face down opposition on their own backbenches, they dithered and delayed instead, ultimately building less than a third of the cells that they promised, and as a result they left our prisons overcrowded and on the point of collapse. Later this week, I will set out a realistic plan for building the 14,000 prison places that we need in my 10-year capacity strategy, and I will ensure that our prisons are never left on the point of collapse again.
Antonia Barnes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Justice Secretary for that answer. In common with many members of the House, I've heard horrific stories of perpetrators breaching orders they're subject to, giving them further opportunity for them to terrorise, to injure, or in some cases kill women protected by these orders. May Harshita Brella and so many others rest in peace. What action is she taking to assess and improve the effectiveness of civil orders in safeguarding survivors of domestic abuse?
I thank my friend for her question. She will know this government has launched a pilot of domestic abuse protection orders in a number of areas, which will bring together the strongest possible protections for victims from other existing protective orders into a single order. Breaching these orders will be a criminal offence of up to 5 years in prison, and unlike other orders, there is no maximum duration.
Secretary of State Robert Jenry.
In London, there is a phone theft epidemic, and this time it's not the former Transport Secretary on the loose. Last year, more than 64,000 mobile phones were reported to the police as stolen in the capital alone. The small number of individuals responsible should be locked up for a long time. And yet, last month, a criminal who used a motorbike to steal 24 phones an hour was jailed for just 2 years. Enough is enough. Will the Justice Secretary commit to dramatically increase sentences for career criminals, get them off our streets and slash crime?
Where was the Shadow Minister over the last 14 years when the theft epidemic began to take place. Again, I would urge him to consider, given the scale of his party's general election defeat, some humility is usually required, perhaps even an apology to the British public before he and others can earn the right to be heard again. He is right about the issues in relation to mobile phone theft, and the Home Office and the Home Secretary in particular are meeting with tech companies to talk about how we can break the business model of these criminals.
Cousin marriage has absolutely no place in Britain. The medical evidence is overwhelming. It significantly increases the risk of birth defects. And the moral case is clear. We see hundreds of exploitative marriages which ruin lives. Frankly, it should have been stamped out a long time ago. Will the Justice Secretary commit to ending this medieval practice which is rearing its head once again in modern Britain?
He'll know that there has been a recent Law Commission report on marriage law more generally, and the government is going to consult on broader reform to marriage law, and we will certainly consider the issues that he's raised before setting out a public position.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents work at HMP Swinfen Hall in Staffordshire, although boundary changes took it out of my constituency recently. Many of the officers that I speak to there are very concerned about the retention of prison officers at the start of their career, getting into that more experienced roles and making sure that experience is retained there. Can she reassure me what steps are being taken to encourage the retention of those experienced members of staff?
One of the very first actions of the government was to accept the Prison Service Pay Reviews Body's independent recommendations in full, delivering a pay increase of 5% for prison officers. In addition, we monitor exit interview data, and we use this to help design interventions to improve retention.
Ellen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 4 people of working age in the UK have a criminal record for a variety of reasons. Most of these people no longer pose a threat to society, but they're still tied to their past by their criminal record, and they face a lifetime of barriers with employers. What steps is the Minister taking to ensure that the criminal record implications of a sentence do not impact on an individual disproportionately?
Well, she raises an important issue which is always under review, but that's where we are at the moment.
John Davis.
What is the government doing to ensure that offenders are managed effectively in the community? And how will the Minister use technology to monitor those offenders to improve the efficiency of the probation service and keeping the public safe? I particularly welcome the steps in the technology around exclusion zones and monitoring alcohol and drugs within the human body itself.
Thank my honourable friend. Tagging technology can monitor offenders effectively in the community. We have tags that monitor curfews and exclusion zones, tags to impose home duty, the effective equivalence of house arrest, and sobriety tags with a 97% compliance rate. We are currently looking at expanding the use of technology to improve productivity for the probation service, and also will be funding an additional 5,000 new tags in order to expand the use of tech outside of prison.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 50 Albanians in Britain is in jail, and nationalities, including Jamaicans, Iraqis and Somalis, are also disproportionately likely to be criminals. We need better data to inform immigration, asylum and criminal justice policies. So will the government publish the nationality, visa and asylum status of all prison offenders? If yes, can we have a timeline? And if not, can we have a good reason why not?
We have inherited and are currently still using a data collection and publication approach that we inherited from the previous Conservative government, in fact probably from his time as an advisor to the former Home Secretary and Prime Minister. I'll continue to monitor the data that we collect and publish, but we are committed to making sure that we deport foreign national offenders. We are on track to deport more this year than was the case in the previous year, and we will make more progress in this respect.
Jessica Morton.
Mr. Speaker, like other honourable members in South Wales, I regularly hear from constituents with relatives in Park Prison, concerns about safety, state of the facilities, difficult in getting medication and mental health support. I know the Victims Minister and the Prisons Minister visited on Thursday, and I thank them for being proactive. It's been going on a long time. What can the Minister report back on what management are doing to improve things?
I can assure the House and my honourable friend that HMP Park is receiving targeted support, and as she points to the recent visit by my honourable friends to the prison, and the Minister for Prisons in the other place is providing full evidence about this and other matters to the Welsh Affairs Committee tomorrow.
Rosie Duffield.
Elizabeth Fry first began her work to create sex-specific prison facilities for women in 1813 with the primary aim of protecting female prisoners from rape. And in 1823, the Jails Act put this into statute. Yet 200 years later, Fry's legacy is being betrayed as girls and women continue to be housed with boys and men. One such example is Wetherby. Does the Minister agree with me and the Women's Rights Network that Susanna Hancock's work on this is urgently needed? And can he give any indication of when Susanna will conclude her review? Thank you.
There are no girls currently in Wetherby, I would say to the Honourable Lady. We have not changed and will not be changing the policy that we inherited from the previous government in relation to single-sex spaces and the prison system. That policy will remain as it has been, and the Women's Justice Board will be considering the issues that relate to female offenders across the women's estate.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme is a vitally important part of the justice system, but among the gaps in the framework we inherited is interim support for victims of crime under 18 before they can access their award. This is having profound consequences for 3 of my young constituents who are victims of rape and their families in dealing with the consequences of this. So will the Secretary of State meet with me to discuss how we can do more for child victims of the most serious offending and ensure that Seeker is fit for purpose?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. She raises an important point about the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. The previous government undertook a review of the scheme. It ran 3 consultations respectively. When the election was called in May, no response to those consultations had been published. We are currently considering the support we provide to victims, including child victims, and we are revising on a new victims code in the new year specifically to look at that issue, including any response to the review, and we will set out our plans in due course.
Neil Shastrey-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Since the beginning of this year, 17 inmates have died in HMP Park. It has been under the control of G4S since its opening in 1997. What consideration has the Lord Chancellor made of returning the prison to the MOJ?
As I said in answer to the question from my honourable friend, HMP Park is receiving a lot of attention at the moment. The Minister in the other place for prisons is answering questions tomorrow in thorough detail, and the Minister, the honourable member might wish to attend that meeting.
Alex Baker.
Speaker, 2 weeks ago I visited Curry's in Farnborough Gate after their staff suffered yet another horrifying steaming attack. A gang of 6 men stormed into the store, destroyed products and stole products and terrified customers. How will the department's sentence review contribute towards cracking down on this trend of appalling behaviour?
Well, the Independent Sentencing Review will be making recommendations to make sure that our sentencing legislation and framework is fit for purpose, and that we always have prison places for those that do need to be locked up, so that our prisons can create better citizens and criminals as well, and so that we can expand the use of punishment outside the prison. I won't get ahead of what that review might recommend, but it will be looking at all of these issues in the round.
Gregory Campbell.
The smuggling of illegal drugs into prisons has been a problem for many years. The last government spent over £100 million trying to deal with the issue. What plans do the government have to try and comprehensively deal with it?
He is right. Drugs are rife in too many of our prisons, and it has been a problem that has been very, very difficult to challenge, both for the previous government and no doubt for us as well. Partly, we have to make sure that we can crack down on supply of drugs into our prisons. That's why we're expanding the use of no-fly zones. He will know that scanners have already been used, but instead, of course, hardened criminals are moving on to using drones more and more. So we'll crack down on supply, but we do need to look at demand and getting more of our prisoners off drugs whilst they're in prison.
Shaw Welsh.
The indictment of the previous government is the current court backlog across England, with nearly 1,800 in Nottinghamshire alone. Rape victims are waiting on average over a year to have their case brought to trial, if it gets that far. Could the Minister tell us what her department is doing to prioritise these cases and restore faith in the criminal justice system for victims of rape and serious sexual offences?
My honourable friend is right that justice delayed is justice denied, and our hearts break for those victims that are waiting too long for those trials to come. That's why we've got to tackle the Crown Court backlog. We're doing so through keeping open 16 Nightingale courts, through the recruitment of more judges. But as I said before, we need fundamental reform, and that is what we are going to bring about.
Ledley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to boost public confidence in the criminal justice system, can the Minister confirm that the Government will not resort to increased dependency on community sentences, many of which are often unserved?
Well, as you will have heard me say many times, we have brought forward an independent sentencing review in order to look at the issues of sentencing in the round, to make sure that we are never in this position again where we are about to run out of prison places and cannot lock up those who must be locked up for reasons of public protection. The review will also make recommendations on how we turn things around in terms of prisoner rehabilitation as well, so that we can help people turn their lives around, but more importantly, cut the number of victims they create if they go on to re-offend.
Luke Murphy.
Mr. Speaker, last month in Basingstoke, 3 women were victims of spiking while on nights out, an appalling crime that robs individuals of their autonomy, puts lives at risk and leaves women feeling unsafe. Victims like Skylar, Laura and Jade have highlighted serious gaps in awareness and response to spiking, so I welcome the Government's pledge to make spiking a specific criminal offence and train thousands of nighttime economy staff. Could the Minister provide an update on how the proposed measures will be implemented and prevent further incidents in towns like Basingstoke?
I thank my honourable friend for that important question. This Government is committed to bringing forward a new specific offence of spiking. We are modernising the existing legislation, and we are committed to doing so this session, so that no other victims like Skylar, Laura and Jade suffer these abhorrent crimes.
Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 3,000 prisoners are still incarcerated under IPP sentences, which were abolished over 12 years ago, many for offences not intended to be covered by IPP. Will the Justice Secretary commit to expediting the Government plans to re-sentence all prisoners still stuck in indefinite prison IPP sentences and to free up limited prison capacity?
What I would say to the honourable member is, firstly, the last Conservative government was right to abolish the IPP sentencing regime, but that has left us with a cohort within our prison system that are still serving these sentences. I am determined to make more progress in ensuring that, when safe to do so, more of those individuals can come out of prison, but I will not do so in a way that compromises on public protection, and some of these individuals do pose a real risk to the public, and that is why I will not be conducting a resentencing exercise, because that would have the effect of releasing everyone immediately. But we will make progress on getting more people properly rehabilitated and back out of prison.
Brian Lishman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Section 127 of the Criminal Justice Act 1994 sees prison officers banned from taking industrial action. It also limits trade union ability to protect prison officers from attacks on their terms and conditions and wages. Thankfully, these fundamental trade union rights have been reinstated for prison officers in Scotland. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it's time for Section 127 to change and workers' rights fully restored for prison officers in the rest of the UK?
I don't think now's the time to consider that.
We're a hub house.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Avon and Somerset Police is currently doing an excellent job during Bath Christmas market, challenging any individual that is seen behaving inappropriately towards a woman or young female. What more can the Department of Justice do to tackle street harassment?
We are working closely with our colleagues in the Home Office to tackle violence against women and girls. This Government was elected with a landmark mission to halve violence against women and girls over the course of a decade. That includes all crimes against women and girls, particularly around harassment, and we are working together to make sure that happens.
Apple.
Thank you,
Mr Speaker, can I welcome the Secretary of State's approach in recognising that we can't continue as we have always done. She will know that county lines is having an impact across towns and cities across the country and a particularly devastating impact on children. So can she outline the options a sentencing review might explore to effectively disrupt the criminal networks and protect vulnerable young people?
Well, the sentencing review will primarily look at the sentencing framework and the way that we treat different cohorts of offenders within that, and it will consider drug crime as well. On the specific issue of county lines, however, I will ensure that she gets a response from the Home Department.
Shannon?
Only a couple of days ago, a prisoner was let out under his government's early release scheme, was wanted for removing his GPS tag. What assessment has been made on the reoffending rate so far since the start of this scheme? Thank you.
Well, anybody who breaches their licence conditions can be recalled immediately to prison, and so if somebody removes their tag, they can be recalled and will be recalled. We haven't seen rates of recall under the STS 40 scheme that are higher than what would normally be the case, and they haven't changed our projections in relation to prison capacity.
Joe, the Select Committee. Anne.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Last month, the Justice Committee visited Central London County Court, one of the busiest in England, and met the exceptional and resilient people who run it, both judicial and administrative. They need to be resilient as their work is contained in thousands of paper files that are stored, transported and updated in a way that Dickens would have recognised. When are we going to digitise civil justice?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The modernisation of the courts and the digitisation programme is a priority. Clearly that can increase efficiency in the progress of cases and also improve the workings of case management. It's something that we are looking at. We're working in close cooperation with our colleagues in the judiciary to ensure that we make progress in that area.
That completes questions. Right, the front bench, change over.